I think this is an important talk. It's a talk about food. And food, I guess I don't need to tell you that it affects all of us, but we don't take it seriously enough. And this is, in part, an argument about why we should. It's not a typical TED Talk. There's no slides. That's not a mistake. Your eyes are fine. It's not funny or cute or optimistic. It's not off the cuff. It's something I've worked on hard. So have all the other speakers, obviously. But I want you to take it seriously. I'm speaking in order to be heard. The words should suffice. It's a call to action. The fact that most of us never think seriously about food, or rarely think seriously about food, and take it for granted, is a problem. So I have 3 goals here. I want to convince you that food has spurred a series of crises in public health, in the environment, and elsewhere, and that's easy. I want to talk about how we might provide good food for everyone, a process that will help us create a healthier and more just world. And that's one of the great earth and people-saving changes of the 21st century. Nothing is more important than food. Changing food changes everything. And I want to define good food. We haven't really done that. What does good food mean? That's a question that needs answering. A couple of preambles. In a country and a world that seems incapable of dealing with its biggest problems, climate change comes to mind immediately. It's hard to be optimistic. But we can be hopeful, and we can do the exciting, hard work that'll result in visible progress, which will in turn generate optimism. We need action, and we must work. Another initial comment. Knowing my reputation, some of you may be here to hear me tell you how to eat. And my goals are loftier than that today, but that'll become clear. But it doesn't do any harm to spend a minute on it. My most recent book is called Animal Vegetable Junk for a reason. The first 2 are traditional human foods, and the third was invented in the 20th century. It's where our chronic disease problems come from. So, if we eat animal products, we must do so in limited quantities as our ancestors did. For reasons of climate change, personal health, resource use, cutting back 50% or more on animal products would be a good measure for most people. Plants, we have to eat as close to their natural form as possible and in increasing quantities. That means fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, legumes, whole grains. For most of us, that probably means the right decision would probably be to quadruple the amount of plant food we ate. And junk, we should really eat none at all. 0 is a very tough number, I recognize that. But if we think of junk food as the cigarettes of the 21st century, which I believe is how they'll be seen, and we act accordingly, that's the right decision. Junk food is really at the root of all of our diet-related problems. So that covers eating. It's pretty easy. The final preamble, there's a lot of preambles, I guess. The final preamble that may avoid some frustration begins with the question, who is this guy and why does he think he knows so much? So, a little about me. I've spent 50 years in food. I've probably cooked as many different kinds of food as anyone alive, and I've certainly written more recipes. It may be hyperbole, but I've written a series of books called How to Cook Everything. 30 years, thank you, 30 years into my career, just over 20 years ago, I recognized a few things I should have seen earlier. 1, the way we eat damages our health. 2, the way we raise food damages our environment. And 3, the way we process and deliver food damages our society. So I started to write more and more about these issues. After all, food is about more than cooking in restaurants. And eventually I became the first food-oriented weekly opinion columnist in a major newspaper. That paper happened to be the New York Times. When that wasn't enough, because it wasn't, for reasons I can discuss some other time, I wrote Animal Vegetable Junk. Because the more I read and the more I talked and the more I wrote, the more concerned I became. I'm convinced that you can't find a better lens into what's wrong with our country and the world today than food. And yet, again, most of us take it for granted. And again, that's a mistake. And now, a year after finishing Animal Vegetable Junk, I think I've developed a way to share the most important part of this accumulated knowledge in a pretty straightforward fashion. So this will take 5 or 10 more minutes. To recap my goals, I want to convince you that the food system is a problem. I want to define what good food is, and I want to propose a way to get that good food to more people. Most food, guess what, is not good. More than half the calories in the United States come from ultra-processed food, and that junk goes a long way to causing our skyrocketing rates of chronic disease and our increasingly shortening lifespans. Our diet also plays a large role in the climate crisis and other environmental damage like rainforest destruction, carcinogenic landscapes, species extinction. You might say, and people do, that if we all simply eat differently, the food system will change. And there's truth in that, but the bigger truth is that the food system must change in order for us to eat differently. The food supply, the way food is planned and grown and processed and distributed and offered to us, is a great determinant of what we eat. In fact, the best way for all of us to eat better is to make changes to the food system. If it's odd to think of food as destructive, let me paint a picture for you. Imagine an alien force of invaders from another planet, another country, turning our food into a disease-causing vehicle, making our rates of chronic disease triple, shortening our lifespans. Imagine them stripping our land of nutrients, wasting our valuable farmlands growing things that are unnecessary, even damaging. Imagine them spraying and spewing cancer-causing chemicals into the air and water. They torture our land and animals. They vacuum the fish right out of the sea. They ruthlessly exploit our most vulnerable workers. They manipulate our children who grow up craving foods that are actually anti-nutritious. Through all of this, they kill more than 1 million of us a year, way more than COVID, but much more quietly. We would try to fix that as fast as we could, even if it meant declaring war. Yet we'd allow it because it's developed slowly and insidiously, and because not only have we been trained to worship at the altar of high yields, but because most of us can buy a tomato or a cheeseburger or a mango within 5 minutes of where we're sitting. For this, we tolerate the illness, the cruelty, the unfairness, the environmental destruction. We ignore the true costs of the food system, which is not set up, as you might imagine it would be, as it should be, to nourish the maximum number of people it can, as well as it can. Food is a substance that nourishes. And to nourish means to promote health and growth. This is the dictionary talking, not me. But the majority of calories in the United States are closer to what the dictionary calls poison, something that causes harm or ill health, than to food. Good food starts with farming, yet American farm policy subsidizes the production of food that's destructive rather than health-giving. We could, just as readily subsidize the production of food that encourages farmers to care for the land, grow food that will nourish more people, and still be doing it 100 years from now. Obviously, that would be a profound change, but it's a change we can begin now by starting to eliminate subsidies for commodity farming and using them instead to support truly sustainable farming that produces real food. As big as that change is, that's only one of the 4 pillars that supports and defines good food. The second is labor. Many of the worst paying jobs in the United States are food-related. Food workers are the farm workers you see stooped in fields as you whiz by, the overworked and bathroom-deprived slaughterhouse workers you read about, the masked people on bikes bringing delicious food to your door in miserable weather, the obviously unhappy fast food worker, the harried server at your local restaurant. Almost needless to say, these people are most often immigrants, people of color, and/or women, the all too commonly disempowered. But these are the people who make it possible for us to eat. To treat them right, to avoid having a bitter taste in our mouths, we must make the minimum wage a living wage and make sure that our most valuable workers have access not only to living wages, but to health care, to child care, and to higher education. Someone just asked me what the most important trend was in food right now, and I said, paying workers a decent living wage. That is the most important trend in food right now. Nutrition is the third pillar of good food, and I've kind of already discussed it. Everybody knows about ultra-processed foods and illness, yet we continue to allow our children to be targeted by marketers of junk, purveyors of poison. The first steps to remedy this are to improve school lunches, teach our children the truth about food, and limit the ability of marketers to sell junk to 4-year-olds without restraints. Now, some parents, some people, can afford to change their diet in the ways I recommended when I first started speaking. And that brings us to the fourth pillar of good food, access and affordability. Sadly, the US food system makes unhealthy choices ubiquitous and cheap, while healthier foods are less common and more expensive. Thus, the nation's poorest people have the most difficult time changing their diets for the better and suffer the consequences. Most people who don't eat well have no other choice. Fixing that means making access to good food universal, shifting more of those federal dollars from supporting the production of sugar and beef to food that supports health. Another change that may be inevitable, but isn't just around the corner. I'm going to summarize. Good food should benefit everyone who produces it, everyone who works with it, everyone who eats it. It must be fair and just in the areas of farming, labor, and the environment. It must be nutritious, and everyone should be able to find and afford it. It's a lot. In short, good food prioritizes human well-being over agricultural yield and corporate profit. You can't have good food without having fairness and justice baked in. All of this makes it clear that good food is, if not rare, then not particularly common, certainly not the default. So the question is, why not? Why don't we want to protect the land, feed ourselves well, reward the people who enable us to do that? The answer is as clear as it is under-discussed. Although it's possible to meet all of these requirements, it's impossible to do so profitably. And since the system prioritizes profit is indeed the organizing principle, food businesses survive by systematically shortchanging producers, the environment, workers, even eaters. To create a good food system as I've defined it, we have to redefine profit and recognize that long-term well-being for all of us is more important than riches for the very few. Indeed, long-term well-being is more practical and more sustainable, not only for the planet, but for our species and even for our individual selves. I know that achieving this sounds like a pipe dream, but change is inevitable. We know that. And our job as humans, as citizens, is to try to guide that change in a direction that benefits as many of us as we can. Rather than taking a rotten food system as a given, we have to fight for one that works for all of us. Aside from the measures I've already mentioned, support for better farms, shifting of subsidies to make good food more affordable, improving wages, and so on, there are some specific and obvious first steps relating exclusively to food. Getting the routine use of antibiotics out of factory farms, making animal production transparent and ethical, regulating pesticides so they don't poison humans or other non-targeted species, limiting the marketing of junk food to kids, putting land into the hands of people who've been shut out until now, people who will farm it well. There are many, many other steps we can take, but these few would make a fine start. Much of this means government involvement, but because there's nothing more important than food production, it's likely the government will always be involved. And that's okay, because food, even more than roads and airlines, the military, education, banks, the electrical grid, food is a critical need. We must spend our common money on things to make them work for us. And we must spend it to support the production and distribution of good food as I've defined it. It's kind of what society is for. Some will scoff and say that a system that supports good food, health, well-being, the environment is impossible to achieve. But remember this. Once the divine right of kings was considered permanent. Once the British and others believed they had a right to dominate the rest of the world. Once resources were thought to be inexhaustible. Once individual gas-powered vehicles for all was a great idea. We've gotten past all of that. No one in their right mind believes any of that. We've changed those things, we've changed our thinking about them, and now we must change the system, the food system, as well as the bigger system that contains it, or suffer catastrophe. Creating a just and global food system will give us the opportunity to remake our society in an image that comes closer to our rhetoric. We can build stronger, saner systems that benefit the many, not the few, and communities which all players have a part in building. It's all within our power. We are all eaters. Providing the food we need to sustain ourselves and flourish is the most basic and important human occupation. How we do it defines our present and determines our future. This was a quick talk, which to fit 70 people on in a day we need to do, with possibly more information than you could take in just by listening. I've outlined many of these ideas and more on markbittman.com, where you're welcome to visit and join me. Thank you very much.